The morning mist clung to Lake Erie's surface like a shroud, concealing the destiny that would unfold on September 10th, 1813. Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry stood at the bow of his flagship, the USS Lawrence, watching the fog slowly lift to reveal the imposing silhouettes of British warships in the distance. The fate of the Northwest Territory, and perhaps the entire War of 1812, hung in the balance on these contested waters. Perry had arrived at Presque Isle Bay earlier that summer with a seemingly impossible mission: construct a fleet from nothing and wrest control of Lake Erie from the British Royal Navy. The British had dominated the Great Lakes since the war's beginning, using their naval superiority to supply their forces and coordinate devastating raids along the American frontier. General William Henry Harrison's army remained trapped in Ohio, unable to advance into British-held territory without naval support to secure their supply lines across the lake. The young Commodore, barely 28 years old, faced challenges that would have daunted veterans twice his age. He had no ships, no experienced crews, and precious few resources in the wilderness of northwestern Pennsylvania. Yet Perry possessed something more valuable than material advantages: an unwavering determination to break British control of the inland seas. Working with master shipbuilder Daniel Dobbins and naval constructor Noah Brown, Perry had overseen the construction of an entire fleet in the forests of Erie County. The sound of axes and hammers echoed through the Pennsylvania wilderness as trees were felled, shaped, and assembled into instruments of war. The flagship Lawrence, named for Captain James Lawrence, who had died commanding the USS Chesapeake, took shape alongside her sister ship, the Niagara. The British, meanwhile, had not been idle. Captain Robert Harriet Barclay, a seasoned Royal Navy officer who had lost an arm fighting under Nelson at Trafalgar, commanded a formidable squadron based at Fort Malden near present-day Amherstburg, Ontario. His flagship, HMS Detroit, mounted 19 guns and represented the pinnacle of British naval engineering adapted for freshwater warfare. The British fleet included the Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, Hunter, Chippewa, and Little Belt, vessels that had terrorized American shipping and coastal settlements throughout the early years of the war. As summer turned to autumn, both commanders knew that time was running short. The British faced a critical supply shortage. Their garrison at Fort Malden reduced to half rations, while Perry's growing fleet threatened to cut off all waterborne reinforcements. The Americans, conversely, needed to act before winter ice made naval operations impossible and before British reinforcements could arrive overland. Perry's greatest challenge lay not in construction, but in manning his vessels. The frontier offered few experienced sailors, forcing him to recruit from every available source. His crews included regular Navy personnel, local militia, freed slaves, and even soldiers borrowed from Harrison's army. Many had never set foot on a ship before, let alone faced combat on the unpredictable waters of the Great Lakes. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through American naval history. As Perry's lookouts reported the British fleet approaching on that fateful September morning, the Commodore knew that everything he had built, everything he had planned, would be tested in the crucible of combat. The transformation of Presque Isle Bay from a quiet frontier harbor into America's newest naval base represented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the War of 1812. Perry had arrived in March of 1813 to find little more than a sheltered anchorage and a handful of buildings. By late summer, the bay bustled with activity as the sound of construction echoed across the water day and night. Master shipbuilder Daniel Dobbins, a local merchant who had escaped British capture earlier in the war, proved invaluable in selecting suitable timber and organizing the workforce. The forests of northwestern Pennsylvania provided abundant oak and pine, while iron for cannons and anchors had to be transported over primitive roads from Pittsburgh foundries. Every nail, every piece of canvas, every length of rope represented a triumph over the logistical challenges of frontier warfare. Noah Brown, the naval constructor sent from New York, brought professional expertise to the massive undertaking. Brown had learned his craft in the shipyards of the eastern seaboard, but building warships in the wilderness presented unique challenges. Traditional shipbuilding materials were scarce or non-existent, forcing creative solutions at every turn. Local blacksmiths worked around the clock to forge specialized hardware, while seamstresses from surrounding communities stitched together sails from whatever suitable cloth could be found. The flagship Lawrence emerged as the crown jewel of Perry's fleet. At 110 feet in length and mounting 20 guns, she represented American naval ambition made manifest on the Great Lakes. Her sister ship, the Niagara, matched her in size and firepower, giving Perry two powerful brigs capable of challenging the largest British vessels. The smaller ships, Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, Somers, Porcupine, Tigress, and Trip, would provide crucial support in the coming battle. According to naval historian Robert Malcolmson's comprehensive account in Lords of the Lake, the construction timeline was nothing short of miraculous, with major vessels completed in less than 6 months under frontier conditions. This achievement spoke to both American industrial capacity and the determination of everyone involved in the project. As the fleet neared completion, Perry faced his most daunting challenge: finding enough experienced sailors to man his vessels effectively. The British enjoyed a significant advantage in crew quality, with many of their sailors having served in the Royal Navy's victorious campaigns against Napoleon. Perry's men, by contrast, came from diverse backgrounds with varying levels of maritime experience. The Commodore's recruitment efforts cast a wide net across the northwestern frontier. Regular Navy personnel formed the core of his crews, but their numbers were insufficient for the growing fleet. Perry appealed to the War Department for additional manpower, eventually receiving soldiers from various Army units who showed aptitude for naval service. Local militia volunteers, many of whom had never seen a ship before arriving at Presque Isle, underwent intensive training in seamanship and gunnery. Perhaps most significantly, Perry actively recruited African Americans, both free and enslaved, recognizing their potential contributions to his cause. This decision, controversial in its time, would prove tactically sound as these men demonstrated exceptional courage and skill during the coming battle. The diverse composition of Perry's crews reflected the democratic ideals for which America fought, even as the nation struggled with its own contradictions regarding human bondage. Training became a constant activity as summer progressed. Perry drilled his crews relentlessly, knowing that British naval supremacy rested largely on superior seamanship and gunnery. Mock battles were fought on the bay, with crews practicing ship handling, sail management, and cannon drill until movements became instinctive. The Commodore understood that his heterogeneous fleet would need exceptional coordination to overcome British advantages in experience and training. As September approached, Perry knew his moment of truth was at hand. Captain Robert Harriet Barclay stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Detroit, surveying his squadron with the practiced eye of a veteran Royal Navy officer. The morning of September 10th, 1813, found the British fleet advancing across Lake Erie's choppy waters, there, red ensigns snapping in the freshening breeze. Barclay knew this battle would determine not merely control of the lake, but the entire strategic balance in the Northwest Territory. Barclay's naval career had been forged in the crucible of the Napoleonic Wars, where he had served with distinction, under Admiral Horatio Nelson himself. The loss of his left arm at the Battle of Trafalgar had not diminished his fighting spirit, but rather hardened his resolve to serve king and country wherever duty called. Now, far from the Mediterranean's azure waters, he faced a different kind of challenge on the freshwater seas of North America. The British squadron that sailed toward Perry's fleet represented the finest traditions of the Royal Navy adapted for Great Lakes warfare. HMS Detroit, Barclay's flagship, mounted 19 guns and flew the flag of British naval supremacy on the inland waters. The ship had been constructed at the Amherstburg Naval Yard, using timber from the surrounding Canadian forests, her design incorporating lessons learned from years of freshwater combat. Queen Charlotte, the second largest British vessel, carried 17 guns and served as the squadron's second-in-command under Captain Robert Finnis. The remaining ships, Lady Prevost, Hunter, Chippewa, and Little Belt, were smaller but no less important to British strategy. Each vessel represented months of careful construction and preparation, their crews drawn from the experienced ranks of the Royal Navy and the Provincial Marine. Ranks of the Royal Navy and the Provincial Marine. The British faced mounting pressure as the summer of 1813 drew to a close. Fort Malden, their primary base on Lake Erie, was running desperately short of supplies. The garrison had been reduced to half rations, while ammunition and other essential materials dwindled with each passing day. Barclay's squadron was the lifeline that kept British forces in the region operational, but Perry's growing fleet threatened to sever that connection permanently. Intelligence reports had kept Barclay informed of American naval construction at Presque Isle Bay throughout the summer. British spies and sympathizers provided regular updates on Perry's progress, revealing the remarkable speed with which the American fleet was taking shape. The window for decisive action was rapidly closing, and Barclay knew that delaying the confrontation would only strengthen his opponent's position. The captain's strategic situation was complicated by factors beyond his immediate control. The Royal Navy's resources were stretched thin across multiple theaters of war, with the ongoing conflict against Napoleon demanding priority attention. Reinforcements and supplies for the Great Lakes squadrons arrived irregularly, if at all, forcing local commanders to make do with whatever materials they could obtain or manufacture locally. Personnel shortages plagued the British fleet even more than material concerns. Experienced sailors were at a premium throughout the Royal Navy, and the Great Lakes commanded relatively low priority in the Admiralty's calculations. Barclay's crews included regular Navy personnel, but also soldiers from various regiments who had volunteered for naval service, Canadian militia, and even some impressed Americans who had thrown in their lot with the Crown. The approaching battle would test not only the ships and guns, but the very different philosophies that guided the two fleets. The British relied on their time-tested traditions of naval warfare, emphasizing disciplined seamanship and concentrated firepower delivered with mathematical precision. Their crews had been trained in the methods that had made the Royal Navy, master of the world's oceans, adapted for the unique challenges of freshwater combat. As the morning progressed and the two fleets drew closer, Barclay could see that Perry had arranged his vessels in line of battle, the traditional formation that had decided naval conflicts for centuries. The British captain smiled grimly, recognizing that his opponent intended to fight according to established naval conventions. This was exactly the kind of battle where British experience and training should prove decisive. The morning sun had burned away the last wisps of fog as the two fleets approached each other across Lake Erie's wind-whipped surface. Commodore Perry stood on the Lawrence's quarterdeck, his battle flag streaming proudly above. "Don't give up the ship," the dying words of Captain James Lawrence, for whom his flagship was named. The distance between the opposing squadrons closed steadily as both commanders maneuvered for the most advantageous position. At approximately 11:45 that morning, the British opened the engagement when HMS Detroit's long guns thundered across the water. The iron balls whistled through the rigging of the Lawrence, announcing the beginning of what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in American history. Perry had positioned his fleet in line-ahead formation, with the Lawrence leading, followed by the Caledonia, Niagara, and the smaller vessels bringing up the rear. The British squadron, commanded by Captain Barclay from HMS Detroit, had formed a similar line with Queen Charlotte supporting the flagship. The tactical situation initially favored the British, who possessed superior long-range guns and more experienced crews. Barclay's strategy was to use this advantage to disable the American vessels before they could close to effective range with their shorter-barreled carronades. Perry's plan depended on closing the distance rapidly to bring his powerful short-range guns into action. The Lawrence mounted two long 12-pounders and 18 32-pound carronades, weapons that could devastate enemy vessels at close quarters, but were ineffective at long range. The Commodore needed to survive the initial British bombardment and reach the distance where his guns could reply with devastating effect. The Lawrence bore the brunt of the British fire as she led the American line toward the enemy. Shot after shot crashed into her hull, while grape shot swept her decks, cutting down sailors and Marines with mechanical precision. Perry found himself fighting not just one ship but effectively the entire British squadron, as the wind conditions prevented his supporting vessels from closing quickly enough to share the punishment. Captain Jesse Elliott, commanding the Niagara, faced contrary winds that kept his ship from effectively supporting the flagship. This tactical situation, whether due to wind conditions or other factors, would become a source of controversy that followed Elliott for the rest of his career. The Lawrence fought essentially alone against superior numbers, her crew displaying courage that would become legendary in American naval annals. As the battle intensified, the carnage aboard the Lawrence became horrific. British gunners, trained in the traditions that had made the Royal Navy supreme, poured shot after shot into the American flagship. The vessel's bulwarks were shot away, her masts splintered, and her deck became slippery with blood. Perry's crew, many of whom had never seen combat before, stood to their guns with remarkable determination. The Commodore himself seemed to bear a charmed life, moving constantly about his ship to encourage his men and direct the battle. His blue uniform coat was torn by splinters, his face blackened by powder smoke, but he continued to command with the cool precision that marked professional naval officers. When the ship's surgeon reported that the wounded were overwhelming the sickbay, Perry ordered that the dead be thrown overboard to make room for those who might yet be saved. By mid-afternoon, the Lawrence had been reduced to a floating wreck. Of her crew of 103 officers and men, 83 had been killed or wounded. The ship's guns had been dismounted, her rigging hung in tatters, and her hull was shot through in dozens of places. Any reasonable commander would have struck his colors and surrendered to prevent further slaughter. Instead, Perry made a decision that would resonate through American naval history. Grabbing his battle flag and calling for a boat crew, he prepared to transfer to the Niagara, which had finally managed to work her way into effective range. The Commodore's determination to continue fighting, even as his flagship lay dying beneath him, embodied the spirit that would ultimately carry the day. The sight of Commodore Perry rowing through the smoke and chaos of battle, his blue uniform, coat bullet-torn and powder-blackened, became one of the most iconic images in American naval history. The small boat carrying the Commodore and his battle flag threaded its way between the battling ships, somehow avoiding the iron storm that filled the air. British gunners, perhaps awed by the audacity of the act, seemed to pause in their firing as the American commander made his desperate passage. Perry's brother Alexander, serving as a midshipman aboard the Lawrence, watched his older brother's boat disappear into the smoke with a mixture of pride and terror. The younger Perry would later write in his journal that he had never seen such courage as his brother displayed in that moment, when defeat seemed certain and any rational commander would have surrendered. The transfer to the Niagara marked a dramatic shift in the battle's momentum. Captain Jesse Elliott, who had commanded the vessel throughout the morning's fighting, immediately offered to take a boat and rally the smaller American vessels, while Perry assumed command of the fresh ship. The Niagara had suffered relatively little damage during the morning's engagement, her guns were intact, and her crew was ready for action. As Perry took command of his new flagship, he could assess the full scope of the tactical situation. The Lawrence lay a shattered wreck, her colors still flying but her fighting capability gone. The British squadron, while victorious in the morning's engagement, had also suffered significant damage. HMS Detroit showed the effects of sustained combat, her rigging cut up and several guns dismounted by American fire. According to the detailed account published in the Naval Chronicle of 1814, Perry's tactical genius became evident in the battle's second phase. Rather than attempting to continue the traditional line of battle engagement, the Commodore decided to break through the British formation with the Niagara, using her superior sailing qualities and fresh crew to devastating advantage. The British, confident that victory was within their grasp after reducing the Lawrence to impotence, were unprepared for this sudden change in American tactics. Captain Barclay had been wounded earlier in the action, his remaining arm shattered by American shot, leaving the British squadron temporarily without its most experienced commander. The loss of leadership at this critical moment would prove catastrophic for British hopes. Perry brought the Niagara directly into the heart of the British line, her guns loaded with double charges of grape and canister shot. The effect was devastating, as the American ship raked first the Detroit and then the Queen Charlotte with broadside after broadside at point-blank range. The British vessels, damaged from the morning's fighting and caught unprepared for this aggressive maneuver, began to suffer casualties at an alarming rate. The smaller American vessels, inspired by their Commodore's bold example, pressed their attacks with renewed vigor. The Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, and the gunboats that had been relatively ineffective in the morning's long-range action now found themselves in their element. Their light guns and maneuverable hulls proved ideal for the close-quarters fighting that Perry had initiated. The tide of battle turned with remarkable speed. The Detroit, already damaged and with her captain severely wounded, began to fall out of formation. The Queen Charlotte, attempting to support the flagship, became entangled with the smaller Hunter, leaving both vessels vulnerable to concentrated American fire. British discipline, so evident in the morning's methodical destruction of the Lawrence, began to crack under the pressure of Perry's aggressive tactics. As the afternoon wore on, the British position became increasingly untenable. Their ammunition was running low, their casualties mounting, and their formation dissolved into chaos. Captain Barclay, despite his wounds, attempted to rally his squadron, but the damage was too extensive to overcome. One by one, the British vessels began to strike their colors in surrender. The moment of final victory came when HMS Detroit, her mizzenmast shot away and her deck littered with casualties, lowered her ensign in defeat. The Queen Charlotte followed shortly after, her captain killed and her crew decimated by American fire. The smaller British vessels, seeing their flagship surrender, quickly followed suit rather than face annihilation. The sudden silence that followed the last British surrender seemed almost unnatural after hours of thunderous cannon fire. Smoke drifted across Lake Erie's surface, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and the aftermath of battle. Commodore Perry, standing on the Niagara's quarterdeck, surveyed the scene of his remarkable victory with emotions too complex for simple description. The American fleet had achieved what many thought impossible: complete victory over the Royal Navy in a stand-up fight. Every British vessel had been captured, their crews now prisoners of war. The Detroit, Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, Hunter, Chippewa, and Little Belt all flew American colors above their British ensigns, a sight that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Perry's first concern was for the wounded on both sides. The Lawrence alone had suffered 83 casualties out of her crew of 103, a casualty rate that spoke to the ferocity of the morning's fighting. The British had suffered similarly, with Captain Barclay among the seriously wounded and Captain Finnis of the Queen Charlotte among the dead. The Commodore ordered his surgeons to treat British and American wounded without distinction, a gesture that earned him respect even from his defeated enemies. The famous message that Perry dispatched to General William Henry Harrison became one of the most celebrated communications in American military history. "We have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." The simple, direct language perfectly captured both the magnitude of the victory and Perry's understated style of command. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Lake Erie extended far beyond the immediate naval victory. British control of the Great Lakes, maintained since the war's beginning, was now broken. General Harrison's army could finally advance into Canada, supplied and supported by Perry's fleet. The British garrison at Fort Malden, cut off from waterborne supplies, was forced to abandon their position and retreat deeper into Canada. The victory at Lake Erie also marked a turning point in American naval confidence. The Royal Navy, which had dominated the world's oceans for decades, had been defeated by a hastily assembled American squadron, manned largely by inexperienced crews. The psychological impact of this achievement resonated throughout the United States, proving that American naval forces could meet and defeat the world's premier naval power under the right circumstances. Perry's tactical innovations during the battle became subjects of study in naval academies for generations. His decision to transfer from the damaged Lawrence to the Niagara in the midst of battle demonstrated both personal courage and tactical flexibility. The aggressive maneuver that brought the Niagara through the British line showed how traditional naval tactics could be adapted to specific circumstances and enemy weaknesses. The battle also highlighted the importance of logistics and industrial capacity in modern warfare. Perry's ability to construct an entire fleet in the Pennsylvania wilderness, using local materials and improvised methods, demonstrated American resourcefulness and determination. The victory proved that naval supremacy could be achieved through superior organization and willpower, even when facing experienced professional opponents. The human cost of the victory was substantial. American casualties totaled 27 killed and 96 wounded, while British losses were 41 killed and 94 wounded. These numbers, though relatively small by the standards of European naval battles, represented significant sacrifice for the small communities that had provided the crews for both fleets. In the broader context of the War of 1812, the Battle of Lake Erie proved to be one of the conflict's decisive moments. The victory enabled Harrison's subsequent triumph at the Battle of the Thames, which eliminated British influence in the Northwest Territory and secured American control of the region. Native American resistance, deprived of British support, largely collapsed following these twin victories. Commodore Perry's victory at Lake Erie demonstrated that American naval power, properly organized and courageously led, could challenge even the mighty Royal Navy. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the War of 1812, establishing precedents and traditions that would guide American naval development for generations to come. September 10, 1813, had indeed proven to be a day when the tide of war turned decisively in America's favor.